So one of the things that I love about the tour that we should together, I'd rather be reading for. These aren't just books about books, though they all have that theme running through them. And they aren't just books about women and books, though they all have that theme throughout them as well. But all of the women in your novels, I noticed, are either fighting for or against something, or struggling with something. I don't know if that's the nature of womanhood. I don't know if that's where we are in the time that these were written in the last few years. But with Rose, she's struggling against the proletariat who's censoring books. Obviously, the banned Bookshop of Maggie Banks, I think, should probably give away some of what Maggie is. So Laurie, one of the things that I love about your book is that the struggle there is both on and off the page. And then, of course, Eva, Liesl is struggling against ageism, sexism. So I would love to hear from all of you about the struggle that you wrote into the book and where that struggle came from, how that informed your story.
I'll start. Books library. She's always been this great man when he suddenly falls ill and she's put in charge of the library. So she's, so she has the reins of the place for the very first time. And immediately things begin to go wrong. First, a crisis manuscript goes missing, then one of the librarians does. And over again, she's told that she's got to keep the donors happy and she's got to keep the doors open. But also, she's undermined over and over again by the people who are meant to be reporting to her, by the head of the university, and she's just put in this impossible position. So my book is a mystery at its core, but it's also just about the reality of being a woman at work. And what's funny about this book and about being a librarian, it's a really female-dominated profession. I live in an academic library. I work in an academic library. It feels like I live there. And I've only ever reported to women, which has felt like a real privilege. And I think that all of the women that I've ever reported to would think that they are the basis for Liesl. And what's actually the case is they have a lot of shared experiences, and I've sat in a lot of rooms and watched them be undermined, often by the men who report to them. I've seen them, be asked to take minutes of a meeting because they're the only woman in a room. And I just thought that was a really interesting dynamic to explore. So imagine being tasked with solving a mystery and having handcuffs put on you to solve that mystery, because no decision that you make is going to be felt to be the right decision by the people around you. So I thought that was just something really interesting to explore. I thought that if I was going to write something that was set in a modern workplace, the modern workplace that I know best, that had to be an element there, because it's something that makes every interaction just a little bit harder. It gets better at the end though.
So The Woman in the Library is really a story within a mystery folded into pages of a correspondence. It opens with a letter. The letter's from a gentleman called Leo, who happens to be based in Boston. He's writing to his friend, who is a writer, an established writer in Australia, who we know as Hannah. And in the beginning, he is wonderful. He's very admiring and complimentary. He's enthusiastic about her work. He's checking out her books in bookshops for her. He's even willing to do research. But as the story progresses, you learn a little bit more about Leo, and there is a letter from Leo at the end of each chapter. You come to realize that there's something a little bit odd about Leo. But I think the struggle in that part of the story is for Hannah to actually protect her work. So Hannah is writing a novel and he has an opinion. He has an opinion on how she should write it, who should be in it, who should be the bad guy. And he is her friend in the beginning, and she values his opinion in the beginning, but there comes a point when she starts to push back. And I think I just wrote that naturally because it's a struggle that every writer has. What we want is for people to care about who wants to control your work. And that's the struggle, to push against it and to maintain the integrity of it. The other part of the novel is the story that Hannah herself is writing in response to the advice that she gets from Leo. And that story is about a young Australian writer who is in Boston to write her very worthy first novel under the auspice of a prestigious fellowship. And her struggle is to find her footing in a new place, to find friends, to make friends, to know who to trust and who not to trust. And ironically, the way she makes her first set of close friends is that they happen to be in the Boston Public Library when someone is murdered. They happen to be sitting at the same table, but what that is, you know, in moments of crisis, you quite often latch on to whoever's near you, and suddenly friendships are born out of this shared feeling of shock or horror or grief. And that continues on. So her struggle then becomes the traditional crime fiction struggle of trying to find out who did it. So that's basically it.
So Widowland is a counterfactual set in 1953, and it's a kind of sliding doors novel. What could have happened if England and Germany hadn't gone to war, but they'd formed an alliance, and England has become a protectorate of Germany, but it's a very bad place, and particularly for women who are organized into castes. And this actually genuinely had roots in real history, and under the idea of somebody called Alfred Rosenberg, who was a real figure who thought it was a good way to run society if women really knew their place. And one of the things, so our heroine, Rose, is actually the top caste. She's a Gelly, and her job is in the culture ministry is to correct literature, because one of the problems that the society has is that classic English literature, things like Jane Eyre and Pride and Prejudice and Middlemarch, are really all about women who are a bit kind of intelligent and a bit kind of finding agency and maybe a little subversive. And so Rose's job is to take these novels and rewrite them a bit. So kind of Dorothea Brooke is a bit less obedient, and Lizzie Bennet is a bit less intelligent, and Jane Eyre is just like kind of knows her place. But of course, Rose has never come across these novels because it's a very illiterate society. And as she reads these novels, as I'm sure happened to every one of you, a learning journey begins, and you see how women find agency and also discover that people are trying to control them. Very often men are trying to control them. And so this is a society in which men have control, and the widows in the title are at the very bottom of the rung. They're genuinely, in the end of World War II, in Nazi Germany, there was a category of women who were nicknamed cemetery women because they were over 50, they had no children, they had no man. So they had the lowest rations because they didn't really matter. And I thought it would be fascinating to have this as a group, and they're in the kind of, they live in rundown areas in society. They would be the most literate people in the whole of any society, the women over 50, and they're not allowed books, but they know books already. So it's actually a mystery. It's set over 2 weeks. It's an assassination attempt, and but it's about women struggling against control, and I'm afraid to say very often male control of women.
So Maggie's struggle in the banned bookshop, Maggie Banks, is primarily convention, pushing back against established ideas, particularly ideas around what is a good book, what is a classic, what is literature. Because when Maggie gets to the small town Bell River, she's just thinking, okay, I'm just going to run this bookshop for a few months because my best friend has gone on maternity leave. And Maggie's feeling pretty aimless, so she thinks just an easy gig, get in, get out. But she quickly discovers that the bookshop doesn't sell any books that were written after 1968, because the entire town is obsessed with one author who happened to write a book there, and he wrote his book in the bookshop. And so the author's grandson now kind of runs the town, because all these literary tourists come, all these readers who love the book, they want to see the bookshop where this author wrote his first novel. And so, but the people in town aren't interested in this book that has been forced down their throats the entire time. And so whenever they want to get books that they actually want to read, modern books that aren't literary classics, books in other genres like romance or sci-fi, fantasy, they have to go to the Barnes and Noble one town over. Maggie starts hosting a series of secret events that put kind of a genre twist on classics. So the first one she hosts is What If Moby Dick Were a Rom-Com? And she gets a local author to write a kind of like a short, funny scene, putting that spin on that book. And she, people come, they give the secret password and she lets them in. They turn down the lights so no one knows. And then they hear the scene. A lot of dick jokes ensue. I mean, it's Moby Dick. It's and Maggie starts to build this community of readers, and she starts to sell them the books that they actually want, while keeping it under wraps, trying to keep the author's grandson from finding out. And so Maggie herself isn't even a reader, actually, because she has always grown up having these classics forced down her throats by her English teachers, and she didn't really fall in love with reading in that way. And so we get to see Maggie start to realize books can be fun. And I think that is also something that's just really fun to explore. And so that's Maggie's journey, as she's also pushing back against that convention, the established rules, and what defines a classic.
Wonderful. Both Eva and Shauna, you were writing books that are based on personal experiences, Must Love Books and Bookshop, about your time in the book industry. Obviously, you're still a librarian writing about that. Can you say how much of what you actually experienced, like for you, the characters, these quirky characters that you've written into your book, are they actually based on real people?
I think the University of Toronto libraries would like me to say no. Yeah, I think seriousness. So I'm not a character in the book. I think that's, if you read it, that'll be obvious. The protagonist is quite a bit older than I am, and it is populated by a cast of quirky characters. And that was something that I really loved about working in a rare book library. Libraries are in many ways a unique place because I think they're one of the last workplaces where people actually spend their whole career. Where in almost every other industry, people sort of move around, you change jobs every 5 years. And in libraries, that's not the case anymore. You start there. I've had my job for about 10 years. I'll probably retire there. I'll do different stuff, but I'll work there forever. And so the types of relationships that can develop over that period of time, the friendships that begin and end, everything that can happen, the lingering resentments over something somebody said 15 years ago, and the character quirks that people develop. I found that so fascinating, stepping into the rare books library in particular. At the time that I was there, it was really populated by only older people, and they had all worked together for a very long time. So I found that fascinating. And in a sense, I would say that the characters are loosely inspired. I got a couple of emails. But in this book, like in all fiction, you start with the idea of something. You start with something interesting about someone's personality. There's a character in my book who, his name is Dan Haber. He clings to the use of a Discman way longer than that is a popular form of technology, who wears denim from head to toe. And certainly I worked with a man who was like that, but that's where the similarity ends. To the best of my knowledge, there was not a decades-long emotional affair between two of my coworkers. So I think in fiction, you can start with the ingredients of the quirks that you see in people that I find really fascinating, but you have to turn everything up to an 11 in a way that perhaps doesn't happen in real life. So I think I started with some of the ideas of things I saw, but they're not direct copies of the wonderful, brilliant, intelligent books that
Colleagues.
Yeah. You're watching this on YouTube, guys.
Okay, so Must Love Books, I'll just describe it as my breakup letter to the publishing industry. And the characters in this book, some of them are like loosely inspired by people I worked with who I just adored. That's the thing about publishing, the people are the best people ever. Brooke is an example of that. There is an antagonist in the book who's like a high level executive who is an amalgam of a couple of people I've worked with who just made my life difficult. So I smushed them together to put them in a book and they can live with it. I'm comfortable saying that for something that's going to be recorded on YouTube. And for the band Bookshop and Maggie Banks, most of this, this was my love letter to bookshops, basically. It was inspired by the events that I attended at bookshops. There's a bookshop called Booksmith in the Haight-Ashbury area of San Francisco, where they would host what they called Shipwreck, where it was kind of like erotic literary fan fiction parody where every month they would pick a different book and 6 different writers would be writing a sex scene about a character from that book. And so once it was Lord of the Rings, and one of the characters was the ring. To use your imagination about what kind of antics a ring would get into. Think about this was wonderful. And the characters, I don't think there is a character that came from real life. Belle River is a fictional town. I myself have never worked in a bookshop, and so a lot of this came from my imagination. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, and Solari and CJ, you both do so much research for your books, even though this one is not historical, it's contemporary, because you do, Solari read a historical series, but the research that you were doing on Boston was so inspirational for this. And CJ, of course, you write in historical context. So both of you have such different research processes. I'd love to hear about it. And what maybe surprised you in your research? Something little that ended up making its way into your books.
Well,
I don't mind.
actually, like, research is my life, because I've written 15 novels and most of them have been set around pre-war and wartime Europe and Germany. So I kind of and I was particularly interested in the treatment of women in those at that time and under authoritarian regime. But I really wanted to know the domestic life, what really it was like at that time. And I mentioned the little thing about the rations at the end of the war, which was a real shock. One of the fascinating things for me about studying Nazi Germany was how strong the need to control women was and how it was done. So even if you were of kind of like very good Aryan birth, etc., there was every part of your life would be controlled. When you were a child, you would go to the Bund Deutsche Mädel. When you were a teenager, you would go to the Faith and Beauty Society. If you wanted to marry somebody in the SS, unbelievably, you had to go to SS Bride School, which was a residential place where you went for 6 weeks and you learned not only how to be obedient, but how to tell fairy stories in the right way. That was actually the genesis of Widowland in a strange way. I went to one of these bride schools, obviously no longer functioning. I was astonished that you would have classes in how to tell a fairy story. Cinderella, for example, if you were telling children Cinderella, the handsome prince would be an SS stormtrooper and the ugly sisters would be Slavs, because it was all part of the propaganda, the ideological propaganda. Everything was ideology. And one way of controlling women is to make sure they're busy at all times and they're doing something that is dictated by the state. And I found that very chilling, but I also, the whole point about writing a mystery is usually there's an individual who slips through the cracks, who doesn't like to conform to those things. And that's going to be your heroine. And that is the heroine of Widowland.
So Rocco mentioned when we're in the car that I have an efficient way. My background isn't as an historian, and I was a lawyer before I became a writer, and part of the law is learning how to do things as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible. This book, so generally even when I write historical fiction, I don't do any research before I start, and I have 2 reasons for that. One, when I have an idea, I'm so excited, I want to start writing. But 2, by driving with the story first, it means that the novel is story-led and not history-led. And then when I come across a gap, something I need to know, or something that is necessary to set the book up correctly, I do the research then, and it's targeted research because I know what I'm looking for. So that's, highly efficient in terms of gathering information. What I have learned over the years is that talking to people is a lot more useful than reading 100 books. So if you can talk to a local, they will give you the kind of insights into a place that you will not get from Wikipedia or from doing, Google Maps tours of the area. And so the woman in the library had exactly that genesis. I was writing another book, which was being set in Boston. But the problem was that I'd never been to Boston. I thought, oh, this could be good. But I did have a dear friend who's an American writer who happened to be in Boston working on his book at the time. So I messaged Larry and said, do you mind if I pick your brain while you're in Boston and just get a feel for the place? And he said, of course, and he's very proud of Boston. So happy to do it, anything you need. But what I realized very quickly is that he is actually a proper researcher, unlike me. So not only would he answer my questions, he started sending me things. There'd be menus and maps. And then he started taking pictures of the sidewalks so that I could see how the snow piled up on the snow pile. That's pushing them up on there. And then one day there was a murder about 2 blocks from where he was staying. And he thought, so Larry's a mystery writer. She might want to know what an American crime scene looks like. So he took himself off down there after the body had been removed, and he took footage of this crime scene.
Oh, wow.
So, and he sends it to me. So I'm in Australia. I get an email from Larry, and I open the file attached, and opens film of an actual murder scene. And my husband happened to be standing behind me at the time. And he said, Gee, I hope Larry's not killing people. I was almost certain that he wasn't, but I did recognize that was probably a really good conceit for a novel. So I put that idea away. I knew that the novel would begin with a letter. And it would be addressed Dear Hannah, and it would be from Leo. And that's all I knew. And I finished the other book, then I started on that. And as I wrote, I continued to email Larry and pick his brain about Boston. Thing that didn't make it, oh no, they did make it into the book, but the thing that I found that was a little quirk that was interesting. Australians say boot, Americans say trunk. But if you're from North Carolina, you say boot.
Yeah, well, thank you. Now we can all sound like locals. I think we have time for a few audience questions. So does anyone have a question for the authors up here? Shy.
Do any of you have any favorite authors that you like, that you go to the read?
So many.
Yeah.
How much time do we have?
Let's pick one each.
Well, I just picked up a book downstairs by the author Elizabeth McCracken, who has a brand new book out last week, recently. The Booksellers helped me out, called the hero of this book. And she's primarily a short fiction writer. That's how I came to her work. And she maybe has 1 or 2 novels before. And so she'll go back and forth between writing short fiction and novels. A lot of them are travel based. They're not travel books, but she really will go to a place, be inspired by it, and write about it. Have a use of marionettes in her book, which is strange. She really loves puppets. That makes it sound awful, but she's really wonderful. And the hero of this book, this novel that just came out, is about the death of her mother quite recently, and it's about somebody coming to terms with the death of their mother. And it's short, her short fiction is really accessible. So if you can even read a single short story, they're funny and wonderful and about families and moving and very, very centered in place and in details in that way. And I have her on the brain because I get to take home her new book. Yeah, she's based out of Austin, Texas.
You're an Australian writer, just because I'm Australian, and sure the Americans will be well represented. Dervla McTiernan. She's actually an Irish Australian. She's a recent immigrant to Australia. She writes amazing mysteries that are set in Ireland. The Scholar, I think, was the most recent one, maybe. but there's about 3 or 4 of them. And most recently, she wrote a book called The Murder Rule, which is actually set in America. And Dervla tells me that when the reason she set it in America is that when she was going through university, Irish students come to America to work as domestics during the summer, and she wanted to capture that experience, which, you know, and she does, and it's wonderful. She's a really talented storyteller.
I'm going to say Hilary Mantel, because Hilary Mantel, who wrote Will Call, etc., is the kind of historical writer I kind of adore. She gets so deep into her period that I remember her commenting that when she was writing the Thomas Cromwell trilogy, she actually wrote a check, and she absent-mindedly wrote 1526 on the check. She's kind of I think she's superlatively skilled. It's tragic that she just died, and I'm now reading Beyond Black, which is a kind of funny novel she wrote about a mystic who really hears voices. And I realized that this was an early novel of hers, but actually it's the same thing she did with Cromwell novels, which is that she perceives the past so really that the ghosts are just speaking to her all the time. And I can't think of anybody, any historical writer, who has immersed herself so well into the research and the detail. So you feel you are seeing history, which is, after all, why a lot of us want to read historical fiction, so that we feel we're there. And that's what Hilary Mantel does.
Wonderful. So for me, I will say Ruth Ozeki. I've only read one of her books, The Tale of the Time Being, but it was just so sad and thoughtful. It involved a touch of magical realism. And it was just one of those books where after I read it, I was just like, okay, this has touched my heart and soul. I will read and love anything she does. And I know she has a new book out recently, and I don't remember the name.
It's great. It's the Book of Form and Emptiness.
Yes, okay, and I've seen it, I have it, but it's just sitting on my shelf unread, and I want to get to it because it's just one of those, her first book, or the first book I read of hers, just one of those where it just touched my entire being.
Where you're all hired to work in bookstores now. Like all of those. Thank you for your question. And does anyone have another question you'd like to ask the authors? I have. Wait a second.
Can you talk a little bit about your writing process? Like, do you know how the book is going to end when you begin, or is it something that evolves?
Who's a pantser? Who's a plotter?
Talking about that amongst ourselves. So I am I have been a pantser, I'll say, because I typically don't know how it's going to pan out. I have the idea, and then I may have like a really vague outline, which is just like a few sentences cobbled together, and then the middle is always question mark, question mark, question mark. But I was just telling them that for my third book, which doesn't really exist yet, but it will one day, I wrote an outline for the first time. It was very detailed, and I hated it because I'm not an outliner. I don't do this. I'm not a plotter, but after I wrote the outline, I wrote the entire book in 4 weeks.
English teachers were right.
I don't know what I am, but started as a pantser. Who knows what I am now?
Oh, well, I admire pantsers because I'm the opposite, and I cannot write a book unless I've structured it in outline, and you always do know how it's going to end, almost just as a feeling. I mean, French novelist Flaubert said that he saw all his novels in a feeling, in a form, before he even knew what the subject of the novel was. And you feel the feeling at the end of the novel. And but I have to structure it, otherwise it would be disastrous.
I'm an extreme pantser. I do. I just go. I sit down. I just start to write, and I make every decision as it comes up. I always argue that the advantage of that is that the pace of the novel keeps up because I'm writing to find out what's happening next. So you're unlikely to find great dumps of description about, landscape in my novels because I want to find out what happened. That it's pretty. Yes, and that's the way I've always done it. And part of it is because I didn't know any better when I started, and it worked. And so I just keep doing it. Doesn't mean that the next book won't get me stuck. There's always a point at about 70% through every novel where I think, oh no. No, this isn't gonna work. But at that point, it's where you have to sort of take a deep breath and just keep writing. So that's where the courage of the pants comes.
Team plotter.
Oh.
I guess it's the less artistic way, but I like a structure. It's usually about a page. And what I'll do is I'll figure out, well, you know, roughly what will happen, but a sentence about what will happen in each chapter. I don't have a lot of time to write. I have about 45 minutes a day, kind of, if everything is going right. If no one has woken up early and the work stuff isn't happening too intensely. And so the plotting helps me because while I only have 45 minutes a day to sit in front of my computer and devote to writing, if I have the structure and I've looked at it, I can think about it all day. And I can think about what is going to happen in that scene and how I might like to structure that scene. And that makes my use of that 45 minutes. It lets me really take advantage of it. I love the idea of being able to just sit down and where the story takes me, and maybe one day my child doesn't need so much of me, that would be possible. But for now, I find that yeah, having the structure is just what makes this possible right now.
You know, one of the things we've been talking about during the course of this tour is how none of you, other than you, CJ, in your journalism career, started out as writers. Even though for a lot of you, maybe not so Larry, in the background, can you talk maybe briefly, this is my question, so the audience question, your path to writing?
Oh goodness, all right. Well, started writing in Gilmore Girls fan fiction. Just something I did in the summer. It was mainly fandom that brought me to writing. But yeah, I never like let myself believe this was actually something I would do. And so it was always just something I did on the side. So I went to publishing. So I kind of like books, that's close enough. But and so it was always just something I never really let myself believe was a possibility until one day I just decided to sit down and actually start writing every day. And that was how most of my first book actually came to fruition.
Yeah, I was the kid at school who always writes these stories about the teacher and the other kids, and everybody kind of passes it around. And I knew I wanted to write, but I also thought I'll never write anything that's worth reading until I kind of had a bit of life. And I went into journalism, which was fantastic. It was brilliant. It meant that you could write, but also you could kind of like go and meet really interesting people, and you could. I worked in a diary column for a while, and it was literally, I said, what do we do on this diary column? Because I've been an investigative journalist, and I thought, why am I doing diary column? And they said, it's fine. We just do a little bit of work in the morning. Then we have a really long lunch. And then we get the parties. I can't believe this is the most fun in the entire world. So
I was a lawyer, and look, as much as it isn't strictly writing, it's probably a really good apprenticeship to writing fiction. I was quite happy being a lawyer. I didn't think I was unhappy, but what was noticeable about me is that I was a serial hobbyist. So I was one of those people who pick up a hobby, do it intensely for about 6 months, and as soon as I've mastered it, moved on to something else. So, you know, I've done ceramic doll making, and I've tried to breed miniature cattle. When I garden, I become a resident of Babylon. And so I started writing novels in exactly the same way. I finished the welding course, and I needed something to occupy my time. So I thought I will write a novel. And I thought it would be a novel because I assumed that, you know, 6 months on, I would find something else to do. But from the moment I started writing, it was like I was breathing properly for the first time in my life. And very quickly it became all encompassing. And I found that I didn't care about the law anymore, which is a dangerous place for the lawyer, but for a lawyer, even more dangerous for your clients. So I wound back my legal practice, and now I just write.
Is that because you got to the end of the alphabet? You did welding and then writing.
There's lots of things. You guys like it. Yodeling.
Wanted to be a writer from the time that I was really young, but as an immigrant, I immigrated to Canada as a small child. You cannot tell your parents your plan is to write fiction. Unacceptable. Doctor, lawyer, accountant, not writer. I eventually went to journalism school because I figured that is a real job that you can tell your parents you are doing. That is a thing you can study that leads to a real job. So I thought that would be good enough. But I graduated right into the Great Recession in 2008, into the collapse of print media. The New Yorker did not immediately offer me a job. Don't know where that letter got lost in the mail.
Yeah.
And so I rooted around for a bit, and then I thought, okay, library school, like Shauna, close enough. I like libraries, and I do still really love libraries. I'd be happy to do it for the rest of my life, but I knew that I wanted fiction and that making that art to be something that stayed in my life. So I made a deal with myself. And on the day that I handed in my last paper for library school, I went across the street from my house to a tattoo parlor, and I got a gigantic, really gaudy tattoo of a feather pen on my torso. Here's what I thought. I thought if I never became a writer, then there would never be an explanation for this gigantic tattoo. And I would just look like an idiot for the rest of my life. But if I managed to succeed and publish at least one thing, then everyone who knew me would be like, all right, that tracks. So to save myself from the embarrassment of having to explain away this tattoo, I kept at writing, and thank goodness. I never publish anything else. It's explainable. So
well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. It has been such a pleasure. Was there anything else that we needed to?
Well, I had a question, but it may be a long question, so maybe we should move on.
Oh, okay. Was there anything else for RJ Julia that we needed to say at the end of the event?
And with regard to your question, what we're gonna do is we're gonna have a signing now. So you'll be able to go up and talk to the authors of it and ask the question. I think that would be the best thing. And what we have are all of the books. So if you need any help, they're at the registers. Remember that we have our special bag tonight only. Those of you who are interested in coming back and joining us for other events, please do it. Maybe you can get the card. And please join me in thanking everybody for coming tonight.